My name is Leah Robshaw Robinson, and I'm the executive director of Friends for a NonViolent World, one of the many peace and justice organizations that make up the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, which is also known as MAP. On behalf of all of us at MAP, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event with our honored guest, Andrea Chalupa. So I watched the film Mr. Jones over the weekend, and last night I dreamed that I was riding in a bus. And in my dream, I looked out the window and saw the corpse of a man laying in the gutter, covered in debris. And I'm certain that this disturbing dream was my brain trying to process the horrors of the Holodomor, Stalin's intentional starvation of millions of people in Ukraine, that Andrea Chalupa's film Mr. Jones depicts so clearly. This true story of the journalist Mr. Jones reminds us of the courage and sacrifice that is often required to tell the truth. It also highlights the importance of speaking honestly about our past so that we can understand the lessons that history has to teach us. It is my privilege to introduce Don Shelby. Don Shelby has been an investigative reporter and news anchor for more than 55 years. He formed the I-Team investigative unit in 1980 and promptly won 3 national Emmys. He has won the Pulitzer Prize of Broadcasting, the George Foster Peabody twice. He holds the Distinguished Service Medal from the Society of Professional Journalists and served on the board of directors of IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors. He was honored with the Silver Baton and Scroll by the Columbia DuPont Awards Committee. We are honored to have Don Shelby introduce tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this historical and timely presentation and discussion. Let me begin by saying that Gareth Jones is no stranger to me, having spent my career as an investigative journalist. We in the trade, if you will call it that, know that we are standing upon the shoulders of courageous reporters driven to expose truth, no matter the political or social cost, because journalists trust truth and believe that it will in the end cause change for the better. We know we stand on the shoulders of people like Gareth Jones and Nellie Bly and Ida B. Wells, Rachel Carson, Seymour Hersh, Woodward and Bernstein, and more, many more, too many to mention for the time we have this evening. Sometimes the work of investigative journalism is a tortuous road. One often has to see the truth with one's own eyes, as Hersh did in Me Lies. Nellie Bly in the 1880s saw what passed as mental health asylums by having herself admitted as a clinical case into one of those institutions and then reporting what she saw. First-hand accounting of the facts and presenting them with clarity. But the road to the truth is sometimes tortured, not by seeing the bodies or the policies that lead to lives crushed, oppressed, justice denied, but the road to publication or broadcast of one's findings can be fraught. Management may determine that the material is just too hot to handle, too dangerous to the coffers of the commercial press, offending the social class in which the management circulates. And sometimes there is a corrupt influence fighting against the truth you seek to reveal, as was the case with Mr. Jones and the New York Times bureau chief, Walter Durante, who called Jones' reporting lies. But Gareth Jones persisted, as we all must persist when driven by truth. And he found a man who would publish what he wanted people to know. Now, why that man published that story is another story in and of itself. But even after publication of the claims of the Holodomor, Stalin's intentional killing and starvation of millions of the Ukrainians, that the Soviet Union, aided by U.S. officials, were courting Stalin as an ally against Hitler, they continued to describe Jones' accounts as lies. But we in the business of investigative reporting pin our focus on one adage in particular, and it is know this and proceed. It's not our place to tell the public or the government how it should proceed. But in truth, documented fact placed before an earnest public will result in remedy at some point. And sometimes we have to be patient, very patient. It can take a very long time for truth to battle its way to the top against an array of enemies who would rather the truth not be told. And this is not a relic of ancient journalism history. Forces are arrayed against the truth today as then. Powerful corporations, powerful members of the political class, entire governments often try and succeed and make it impossible to get the truth out. It's a dangerous undertaking, investigative reporting. Just last year, 70 journalists were killed trying to get to the truth. Nearly 20 have died already, covering, not coincidentally, Ukraine and Putin's illegal war and attending atrocities. And sometimes recognition does not come until another person picks up the story and brings it to light for a mass audience. Andrea Chalupa has done this as a screenwriter and documentarian. Her work on Mr. Jones is, in fact, journalism by other means. It is a pleasure to be in her company tonight. She is a soldier for the truth. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, Dr. Carl Mirra, Associate Professor at Delphi University, the author of Soldiers and Citizens, an Oral History of Operation Iraqi Freedom, and has traveled to Ukraine to perform humanitarian aid, a public opinion survey, oral history, interviews. His articles have appeared in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, Ukraine Analytica, Foreign Policy in Focus, and many, many other places. So please welcome, everyone, Dr. Carl Mirra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shelby. That was an outstanding brief introduction to today's event. And I have the great privilege and honor of introducing Andrea Chalupa, who is a journalist and author of Orwell and the Refugees, The Untold Story of Animal Farm. We could have a seminar on the backstory of that book alone, I think. She has written for Time Magazine, The Atlantic, Daily Beast, and Forbes. She has spoken or lectured at Columbia University, McGill University in Canada, and has spoken before the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And she's the founder of Digital Maidan, an online movement that made Ukraine Popular Uprising the #1 trending theme or topic on Twitter. I'm not a Twitter guy, but on Twitter, at the time, as she puts it, this is actually pretty funny, at the time, the media was obsessed with Justin Bieber's arrest. So up against some tough company to get attention on the media. But a very, very, very important, serious endeavor, as Maidan is often misrepresented. And of course, she's the author and screenwriter of the acclaimed Mr. Jones film. And I'll turn it over to Andrea. I'm really looking forward to the insight she's going to offer us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's such an honor. And thank you to Terry and Andy and Carl and Don and Leah. Those were just such beautiful and heartfelt introductions. And thank you for all of your work for human rights, for the truth, wherever you are. So I am Ukrainian American. I was born and raised in Northern California in Davis, UC Davis. My mom and dad were both Ukrainian. They were born in refugee camps right at the end of World War II. My father's family is from Western Ukraine, outside Lviv, and my mother's family is from Donbas, Eastern Ukraine, which is obviously, if you've been following the invasion, the genocide, Donbas is where Putin first started invading Ukraine back in 2014. Obviously, he seized Crimea and then he went to Donbas. I still have family on the front lines who refuse to leave, who are right in the zone of the shelling. They see it as their duty to stay and also the choice of becoming a refugee. Where do you go? Where do you go as a refugee? You have to pick up your whole life. If you don't know, but they also choose to stay. They choose to stay and let the Ukrainian soldiers come, take showers, charge up their phones, get whatever they need. So this war is very real to me, just to sort of illustrate it. My mom, my father, let's say my father is in perfect health. He loves to walk. He loves to play tennis. He got a knee replacement, and he was out and about. 2 weeks later, he's very healthy. When this total genocide broke out a year ago, his health went into sudden decline. It was just a shock to the system that something like this could be happening. These World War II type stories that we're seeing in the news, it's the stuff that I grew up with, that my grandparents experienced to try to get the hell out of the Soviet Union way back in the day. Stories like there were 4 trucks headed down the road and 3 exploded, and we happen to be in the one that survived. Those are stories that are happening right now as we speak. So just to see these dark chapters of history repeating, it is very hard on the soul, very hard on the psyche, and it's just the amount that you need just to stay engaged with this emotionally is very, very, very difficult. So I commend everyone, the peace activists who are standing firm, who are engaging in events like this, who refuse to look away, who see how important it is to bear witness, because that is what the young, ambitious, idealistic Welsh journalist Gareth Jones did. He risked his life and career to bear witness. And I focused on him to tell the story, the little known story of the Holodomor, Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, because growing up in Northern California, my grandfather, my Didlonya, Deed is Ukrainian for grandfather. He was the world to me growing up. He would take me to get donuts on Sunday. I would sing songs for him from The Little Mermaid at the top of my lungs, and he thought it was like fantastic. And it wasn't until I was older that I'd heard and I started to understand the stories of what he survived growing up in Donbass. And how it transformed with the Russian Revolution and the communists coming in, and Stalin, of course, and being a young man surviving through the famine himself. And shortly before he passed away, my grandfather wrote down his life story on a Ukrainian typewriter and gave those pages to me. And when I got to college, I studied Soviet history at UC Davis. And then I spent a summer at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, which is putting out fabulous work right now from eyewitness accounts on this current genocide. And then I traveled alone. I'd saved up some money working in college, and I traveled alone with my grandfather's memoir, typed in Ukrainian, and I lived in Ukraine, and I had it translated into English. And that's when I began in earnest trying to write this screenplay. And that's when I, was in an internet cafe on Kreshchatyk in Kiev when I came across the Gareth Jones's family putting out information about him. And right away, it was a lightning bolt moment where I realized this is my hero. This is who I'm going to try to tell this larger, little known story through. This young man is so brave, so strong, and feeling young and very overwhelmed and lost in the world myself and trying to find direction. And I looked up to Gareth. I saw him as a historical mentor, someone I could cling to in a world that was changing rapidly with Facebook and social media taking hold. And so Gareth was basically my anchor in my 20s. And I'm so grateful that I had that. And I recommend a historical mentor to everyone out there, whoever needs one, because they make a big difference. And so I clung on to Gareth. I got to know his family. I got to know all sorts of historians. I interviewed survivors of this famine that would share their stories with me. And I talked to a lot of children of survivors who shared a very common story that in their family, even though these were families that had immigrated to the safety of America, to the safety of Canada, they were still afraid to talk about what the famine was like, that they carried that terror with them. It's very important to understand that this was an engineered genocide. Raphael Lemkin, the human rights lawyer that developed the Geneva Convention against genocide, who coined the very word genocide, he held up the Holodomor, Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine, as a classic example of Soviet genocide. So the man who invented the concept, the word of genocide himself, held up the Holodomor as the classic example. And so what the Soviets did, and there's great books on this, like as I've mentioned, I think we had a team of historians, including Timothy Snyder at Yale University, who wrote Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, how those two madmen influenced each other. That book opens with the story of Gareth Jones, because that's how much his story captured the hell of the 1930s, the rise of fascism, the rise of communism, and how these two monsters worked together, met each other, and ultimately clashed over what became the Bloodlands, like Ukraine, Belarus, millions killed in genocides, the Holocaust, World War II and so on. So Timothy Snyder was one of many historians on this project. We had historians on the ground in Ukraine. We had historians at the University of Alberta, Toronto. We had a lot of various experts read this to give it life, to give it authenticity. And on top of that, our director, the three-time Academy Award nominated filmmaker, Agnieszka Holland. She's known for doing a lot of powerful, hard-hitting films like Europa, the story of a Jewish boy who hides in Hitler's youth to survive. She also directed the original version of The Secret Garden. She's done a lot of television like House of Cards, The Wire, The Affair, Rosemary's Baby, and so on. Agnieszka Holland, this story was deeply personal to her too. Her parents were both journalists, and she grew up in Soviet-occupied Poland, and her father's official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. He jumped out the window. And sorry. When she read that news as a little girl, when that news was announced in the newspaper when she was a little girl, she went mute. And if you know Agnieszka Holland, for her to go mute is a very big deal. But anyway, so this movie was incredibly personal to her, and she had a lot to say with this film. And so if you watch this film, it's made by people, like a coalition of soulmates who came together. It was a very difficult film to make. All films are inherently difficult to make. It's very comforting when I read interviews with Spielberg and other big time filmmakers how difficult every film is to make, but this one especially because it's a film about a little known genocide. It's not a Marvel movie. We were filming in a heavy snowstorm in Ukraine on the ground. We had crew members in Ukraine crying on set because they recognized their own family stories in what we were filming. We had villagers coming out of their homes to watch what we were doing, old ladies mostly, and they had their own stories because they remembered living through the famine as children. So it was very heavy, and God bless the actors, James Norton and Vanessa Kirby and Peter Sarsgaard. These are extraordinarily in-demand actors who get offered a lot of incredible roles. Vanessa Kirby was in Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise. James Norton is a huge star in the UK. He's on the short list, likely to be the next James Bond. Peter Sarsgaard is in the recent Batman movie. These are actors that could do anything, and they chose to move heaven and earth to join us on set in Ukraine, on set in Poland, and to recreate this world. What brought all of us together was because, truth is powerful, truth matters. And in all of the archives that have opened up since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all the memoirs, all the testimonies, survivor testimonies, all the incredible research that is coming out on this genocide, it's a part of the crime of what the Soviets did in 1933 by deliberately starving Ukraine. Part of the crime is that to this day, most people have never even heard of it. They were so successful in covering it up then. And the machinery of that is very similar to what goes on today. The both sidesing of Russia's current genocide in Ukraine, trying to dismiss it all as a proxy war when Russia has agency. And Ukraine has agency, and Ukraine is fighting back for survival, and so on. And so I want to just play an overview of the film featuring our actors. So let me just share my screen.
This is my report on the Soviet question.
What's your answer?
I don't have one. The Kremlin is broke. So how are the Soviets suddenly on a spending spree?
Paul, I need your help.
Arranging an interview with Stalin.
Garrett, I've been trying to reach you.
Go see Walter Duranty at the New York Times. Listen, I really need to talk to you. I found something big. You can break this story wide open.
Paul?
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Duranty.
So why are you really here?
I need your help.
This is Ada Brooks. She's my star. Paul's dead. It's a robbery 3 days ago.
What do you want?
The story no one is talking about.
I saw him, 4 bullets in his back.
And you don't think it was a robbery? What was Paul working on?
Ukraine.
You know how rich this country is, how vast. South is nothing but wheat fields. Grain is Stalin's gold.
Yes, but whose truth?
They're
We can still do something. No. We cannot let Stalin get away with this.
What do you expect me to do exactly?
The Soviet Union is not the workers' paradise that was promised. It is not the great experiment that you read about in the press. Stalin is not the man who you think he is.
Are you saying there's no hope?
Okay, so that is an overview. So what happens in real life, what you see, the historical beats of in this film is that Gareth Jones was a rising star. He was in his late 20s. He was a foreign secretary to David Lloyd George, the World War I prime minister who was still influential in London. Gareth Jones spoke several languages fluently, Russian, German, French. He was so energetic. He had a way of seeing between the lines, a humanitarian, anti-conformist. He waltzed right into, talking his way onto Hitler's plane, the new chancellor of Germany, and flew across Germany with Hitler and wrote an article saying that if this plane should crash, the whole history of Europe would be changed. And he was right. And that was a big scoop for him. And he followed it up by going to Moscow to chase down rumors of a famine. The real life Gareth Jones had traveled to the Soviet Union, I believe, 3 times total. He knew his way around. He was very close with his mother, who as a young governess had spent time in Donbass, in Donetsk, which was developed by a great Welsh industrialist. And the town is originally called Husakova after John Hughes, this Welsh industrialist. And she was a governess for his children, teaching English and so on. So Gareth grew up with her adventures of being on the edge of the earth. So he was drawn to Ukraine for that reason. So Ukraine was personally important to him. So Ukraine represented my grandfather, who was the world to me. Ukraine represented Gareth's mother, who was the world to him. And that's how our fates, collided. And Gareth came up against this celebrity of his day, whose name was Walter Duranty. He was nicknamed Our Man in Moscow. He was this eccentric character, very bohemian. He was into the occult, which I don't judge, that's his right. But he was a lover of Aleister Crowley, the great Satanist. They'd do these black magic orgies in 1920s Paris. And Duranty would even write these Latin hymns for their orgies, and they would ritualistically sodomize their lovers together, and all this dark stuff, which is great research when you're a college student like I was digging into all this. Duranty would hold court in Moscow. He threw the best parties, and all of the Illuminati that were flocking to Moscow to see this great, exciting experiment of communism up close, they all paid pilgrimage to Duranty. He was the credibility, he was the voice for the world, the window of what was going on over there. And right when he won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Stalin, right when he won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Stalin, that was when Stalin was laying the foundation for what would become the genocide of Ukraine, Stalin was sending his agents into Ukraine. They were deliberately confiscating the food. They eventually closed the borders of Ukraine so that the starving refugees could not leave, people could not get out, aid could not get in, and people were left to starve to death. They're confined in this prison. And when Gareth, talked his way through the front door of the Moscow establishment, name dropping Lloyd George, and he convinced the Soviets to roll out the red carpet for him. He was a hustler, which I admire, and the Soviets sent him on a trip to Kharkiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine. But Gareth, before reaching the city, hopped off the train and walked for many days from empty village to empty village, interviewing people on the verge of death. And he was eventually picked up by the Soviet secret police. And again, he hustled his way out of that situation. And I think the sight of him must have terrified those police, that they quickly brought him to the nearest embassy and got him the hell out of the country. And as soon as he got out, he held a press conference and blew the lid off this thing. The famine became a very big news story. And back in Moscow, Walter Duranty and other illustrious foreign correspondents got together with the Soviet censor, and they made a deal to go into their article, to write articles saying that Gareth Jones is lying. And they did this because if they didn't, they would lose their visas. They would lose their access. They're practicing what's known as access journalism. And the Kremlin did something back then that it's doing today. It took hostages. When rumors of the famine were getting out, when it was becoming harder and harder to contain Stalin's genocide famine, the Kremlin arrested 6 British engineers who were in Russia helping the Soviets build and modernize Stalin's empire. And these 6 innocent men were interrogated, some would say tortured, and thrown into prison. And this was a shocking event. This was like Brittany Griner being arrested. It's like the Wall Street Journal reporter who was just arrested. It was a shocking hostage situation where the Kremlin was taking hostages. And they had that strategy back then to try to blackmail and pressure people into silence. And they have that strategy today. And Gareth Jones called it out, and he was very tenacious in pushing his reporting, but he paid the price for it because Lloyd George, his longtime friend and mentor, wanted nothing to do with him. Gareth had flown too close to the sun. He had created problems between the British and the Soviets. And at the same time, Walter Duranty was trying to broker a deal to get the FDR, the United States, to finally recognize the Soviet Union and bring everyone together so that Western industrialists could go into the Soviet Union and help Stalin rapidly modernize his empire and make a lot of blood money, make a lot of money. So if you're wondering why so many turned a blind eye, it's why so many turn a blind eye today. It's because they want to make money. It's like the Koch brothers, dark money political network. They're funding inside the Beltway people, analysts at think tanks to try to argue that we have to do business with Russia. The economy comes first, jobs, all the money we can make together comes first. It's the same sort of dynamics that you see going on today, which is why it's so important for us to have a united front and to hold fast on sanctions, to push for even greater sanctions. Alexei Navalny, who is facing death in a Russian prison, he and his team provided a list of 6,000 Russian oligarchs that hold up the whole architecture of Russian corruption that should be sanctioned along with their families. And instead, you get all these reports of their families enjoying the good life at ski resorts in France and other places and shopping in Paris and so on. So we really need to close those sanction loopholes, force those corrupt Russians to stay in Russia and live in the country that their corruption and greed is destroying and so on. Like that has to be a part of this. So I am going to just pause here and just let people chime in with questions.
So we're opening up the questions. If folks want to put questions in the chat, I can ask them. We had the chat closed, so I'm just going to give it a moment for the questions.
Well, I hope you learned from that video how photogenic those actors are. They really And they're all so brilliant. They brought so much to that story. They did their own research coming into it. It really felt like a graduate level course being on set working with them. Really, it was very nerdy. It was a very nerdy set, proudly.
Yeah, just to have access to all those scholars that you mentioned and to be able to do that research. It's like having a master's or doctoral degree just in doing that. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, maybe I'll ask you a curiosity question.
Sure.
I have, I don't know if you want to deal with this kind of question. I have a related one that's more practical. But a friend of mine at the university studies historical trauma.
Okay.
Could be passed on generationally.
Yes, I'm fascinated by this topic.
Okay, so maybe I can ask it open-ended. How do you think historical trauma or how this trauma experience might affect, or genocide would affect Ukrainians' mindset today? You just want to comment generally on that?
Yes. I think that's such an important question. I think that's such an important issue. And I think we have to mainstream that discussion for everyone. I think a movie like Encanto, if anyone's seen the movie Encanto by Disney, that's a story, a children's story about generational trauma. it's so groundbreaking, and it set off a TikTok movement of kids sharing what their abuela, what their grandparents were like, and what their mothers were like because of the generational trauma they had experienced. So that opened up a conversation. So I think for the sake of all of us, obviously for Ukraine, any country that's been through a genocide needs a lot of support in this regard. Right, one of the things the Russians did back in World War II, and they're doing today, is systemic rape. So there's one woman, she's in her 50s. She was raped by a soldier in her home who was her son's age. And she's getting therapy. She's getting therapy for that. So one thing that a lot of the aid that us taxpayers are giving to countries, to Ukraine, is to pay for therapists to help the survivors of sexual violence, sexual trauma, rape, mass rape, like a child. I think there's this is a very not uncommon story of a 5-year-old girl being raped in front of her father. Like, this is what our tax dollars are going to support, is healing services, trauma services for these survivors and their families, so they can function, so they can feel any sort of sense of security that they can get back. So I think in terms of that generational trauma, we're going to be living with the fallout of this war for many generations to come. And we all need to be there for this country, no matter what it takes. You don't go through something like that and become okay. And we shouldn't expect anyone to be. Even the trauma of the Soviet Union was something that would wreak havoc on modern democratic Ukraine. There's a wonderful organization, if you want to give money to support Ukraine, there's a wonderful organization that sprouted up with Euromaidan, the 2013-2014 revolution. I know these guys personally. They've been promoted by Stephen Colbert and a lot of celebrities because they do such amazing work. And the group's called Razom, which means come together. Razom, R-A-Z-O-M, Razom for Ukraine. Years ago, they hosted an event where they invited me to speak about this very topic, called "How do you break out of the Soviet mindset?" So the trauma of the Soviet system of keep your head down, hide, the feeling of terror is something that has lingered in Ukrainian society because of what it suffered under the Soviets. And it took this younger generation, Zelensky's generation and younger, that grew up with the internet, that grew up with, getting off being able to watch how Europeans live, how Americans live, being able to watch American movies and having this totally different mindset, with this pop culture mindset, like Zelensky being this goofy comedian. We've seen all these ridiculous clips of him. He's a very modern person. What's at the heart of this war is Soviet man, Putin, KGB man, Putin, versus this modern cosmopolitan European young guy with this young, fresh energy. He grew up with American movies and the internet. It's really a big cultural clash. And unfortunately, that Soviet mindset did create a lot of frustration in Ukraine even before the war among Ukrainians. This idea of you're no longer under terror. You have agency. You have a voice. Your voice matters. And that's a conversation that they were having before the war to try to get people to sort of come out of their shells, I guess you could say. And now that we have this genocide, it's going to take teams of therapists, teams of doctors, teams of psychologists, teams of services to come in, village by village, city by city, and help people come out of their shell and help them feel safe, help them learn how to live without this, help them manage their trauma, because the trauma is there. My grandfather, right before he passed away, wrote down his life story in vivid detail. That trauma that he experienced under Stalin stayed with him. All those years he was taking me to the park, pushing me on a swing, the trauma was there. So yeah, the conversation we need to all be mainstreaming is how to be gentle with that trauma, how to talk to that trauma. And there's a wonderful book that I recommend that I think is worth any of us reading, because we're living in an age of mass trauma. We're living in an age of mass trauma. We just went through a once in a century pandemic together. And so one book for all of us to read, especially to have greater empathy for ourselves and the people in Ukraine and what they're going to be facing for the decades ahead, is this book called The Body Keeps the Score. The Body Keeps the Score, all about how the tricks that trauma can play on you, the danger mapping, the hyper awareness, being hyper vigilant. And I do wonder, with some of like my ingrained thinking, how much of that is the family trauma coming in. You know, I do feel hyper vigilant. I have my podcast, Gaslit Nation, where I'm constantly warning that the worst is going to happen. And unfortunately, I've been proven correct. I wonder if a lot of that hypersensitivity comes from my own family history. Because all those years when I was researching my grandfather's story and reading his memoir and what he survived and what he lived through, yes, I was doing it because I yearned to be close with him again. I missed him. I wanted to be with him again. I wanted something real. But it was also this big question in my mind: what would I have done in that situation? What would I have done if I were him? And I think living through that, you know, the children of the children who are facing this genocide in Ukraine, they're going to be living with that. They're going to be asking themselves those same questions.
Yeah, there's so much in there. I could ask you another 40 questions, but we have some coming up in the chat. Someone on the chat is interrogating the use of the word genocide. I'm sure you're familiar with these arguments. But I also am thinking of, I'm going to butcher the name, Stanislav Kojitsky. He's a historian who wrote on the Holodomor in Ukraine, and he keeps using the word ethnophobia. And we hear so much about Russophobia today, but when he discusses the USSR's behavior toward Ukraine, he uses the term ethnophobia, right? Which we don't hear in the States here. We only hear Russophobia. So I'll ask you if you can please comment on those who challenge. You gave Lemke, which is a pretty powerful example that doesn't seem to convince people, but somehow, what do you say to those who say you shouldn't be calling this a genocide?
Oh, I mean, I would say
essentially that's the question. Yeah, I apologize.
Yeah. No worries. I mean, it's genocide by all definitions of the word genocide. Anytime you're kidnapping thousands of children and taking them away from their home into a foreign country and forcing and basically brainwashing them and telling them that their parents are dead, their parents don't love them, these are your new parents now, your new family, you're going to learn Russian, you're a Russian now. Anytime you just the mass kidnapping of children to reprogram them under another, nationality, another political group is the very definition of genocide. I would urge anyone to go to a dictionary and look up the definition of genocide, which is any group of people, any nation, that faces what is essentially extermination. Just look at the technical term of genocide. It's what's happening today. You have Wagner soldiers. Wagner is a militant group,
right wing.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Wagner is a mercenary group founded by a oligarch close to Putin. It's propped up with Kremlin money. And Wagner is active in Syria, in various parts of Africa, carrying out war crimes. Wagner is named Wagner after after Hitler's favorite composer. It's a far-right mercenary group. And a couple of their soldiers that were forced into this war, they were prisoners who were promised to be freed if they could survive 6 months in Ukraine. They miraculously survived 6 months in Ukraine. They came out to give testimony to a human rights group, a research group, about what they did in Donbass. And they were told by Wagner to go in and just liquidate, just shoot all the people, kill as many people as you can, just erase all the people. And as part of this, they described how one soldier described how he went up to a 5-year-old girl who was screaming and shot her point blank in the head. He shared that story. And so, this is extermination. Putin is losing the war. It was a really stupid miscalculation for him to do this. It shows you what a bunker he's been living in. He's surrounded by a bunch of yes men. He's a dictator who has engineered a propaganda empire for himself, and he's fallen for his own propaganda. And as a result, there's something like 200,000 casualties, killed in action and injured. The best of Russia's military, including generals and colonels and so on, they're gone. They've been killed. Russia has lost significantly more soldiers in 1 year of this invasion than they lost in all 9 years of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It is a historic, monumental military failure. And the corruption that is plaguing this military up, down, it's not going away. All the stealing that they do, because there's zero faith in institutions in the system across Russia, it's not going away. It's only getting worse as people grab what they can in order to make whatever money they can, as all these supplies and all these things make their way to the way down. And they're getting like Soviet tanks out of storage just to have some scrap metal out there, something that they could throw in. And what they're doing is they're pulling prisoners out of prisons across Russia. They're going for the poor. They're going for the republics, the ethnic republics across Russia, and they're getting pushback against that. And it's like there is no winning this war. Like China isn't going to do it, because China is, for all the criticism of China's pragmatic. And so Russia's largely on its own, and there's no turning this around. So what do they have as a consolation prize? Genocide. Kill as much as they can, destroy as much as they can. It was genocide then under Stalin, and it's genocide now. In the years leading up to this total war, statues of Stalin were going up across Russia. Just recently, a monument of Stalin went up, feet away from an old monument to victims of his Great Terror. You had the oldest, largest, most prestigious Russian human rights group founded by Soviet dissidents called Memorial, that for years were trying to bring back names to the nameless, to give dignity back to those who were killed under Stalin, and to fight for historical truth. And you had their historians have their lives destroyed, being arrested by the Russian authorities because they dared to unearth an unmarked grave, a mass grave from Stalin's terror. You had one historian's child taken away from him, and he was accused of pedophilia simply because he dared to be a historian. And Memorial, this group, they dared to show Mr. Jones in Moscow. And what happened? The authorities shut it down and then liquidated the organization, and now Memorial's gone in Russia. And so all those years when Putin was bringing back the cult of Stalin, he was getting this already. Like he was really, he was very clear in telling us what his intentions were. And when the Russians invaded Donbass, eastern Ukraine, all those years ago, 2014, 2015, when the invasion first started, what do you think they did? They put up billboards of Stalin. What is the motivation there? It's empire. It's empire. It's appropriating other cultures. Russians today have such an imperialistic mindset, and they've been fed that constantly on their propaganda empire. They don't know how to see themselves without it. And that is very dangerous, because even if Putin's gone, we're still left with that larger genocidal imperialist culture. And a lot of that seeps into going back generations with Pushkin and others who have glorified this sort of genocidal language of like squashing the Poles, marching. The Soviet Union was like a total term of gaslighting. It wasn't a union. These were captive states that were invaded by Kremlin agents, by Kremlin forces, and the local populations were terrorized. The local languages were banned, and people were forced to speak Russian. And anyone that protested, the whole local intelligentsia of the Baltic states and Poland and so on, were forced to submit and face prison and death and so on. And so, yeah, we're dealing with an imperialist power. We're dealing with unfinished business of World War II, because we used one monster, Stalin, to get rid of the other monster, Hitler. And we always sort of glorified Uncle Joe in the West. He was our great ally. Orwell had a heck of a time trying to get Animal Farm published because it was critical of Uncle Joe. And the publisher that finally dared to put it out, his wife made him wait until the war was over so as not to upset the Soviets. So yeah, right now what we're dealing with is just this unfinished business of World War II. It's like we finally need to get rid of this Stalin monster.
Yeah, there's lots of comments on this, and we try to condense 4 or 5 into one. There's some people mentioning Medvedev and his, Telegram channel, and basically saying we're going to wipe Ukraine off the map. Just read read the Russian media, subscribe to some of their Telegram channels, and your chin will drop. They're literally promoting genocide on those channels. So if people who feel this topic isn't covered, you can just email me and I'll send you the links to the Russians saying it today. So I don't mean to call up the conversation. What you said was better. Here's a more forward-looking question now. Can historical trauma, memories of the Soviet Union's atrocities in the 1930s and the repeat by Putin in today's war actually lead to what is universally seen as the incredible strength of Ukraine's ability to survive?
Could you rephrase the question? Sorry, could you repeat the question? I just want to make
I'll
sure.
rephrase it. I think what they're asking is the historical trauma conversation that we're having, the atrocities that Ukraine has experienced historically, even outside of the 1930s. We'll get into all of it today. Can that be connected to the strength, the resilience, really? That's the word. That
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Chernobyl was when the Chernobyl disaster happened, that was a radicalizing point. The Chernobyl tragedy was a horrific, painful reminder of Moscow's knee on the neck of Ukraine. Chernobyl was a Moscow project. Gorbachev, the authorities lied about how bad this was. A parade was allowed to go on. People died from the fallout of Chernobyl. And it was a reminder of the corruption, the lies, the terror of Kremlin colonization of Ukraine. And so after Chernobyl happened, you had this massive push for independence. When they had an independence referendum, Ukrainians, East, West, North, South, overwhelmingly voted for independence from Moscow. They won their independence at the ballot box. And they've been, trying to build out of that Soviet swamp, if you will, for decades since getting political independence. And it was very hard. And it wasn't without sacrifice. You had journalists, investigative journalists who were killed taking on corruption. But what was really amazing is that they would give birth to a new generation of journalists who would also among them pay the price. So every sort of generation of journalists that came up in Ukraine since the founding of the political founding of the country paid. There would be car bombs, there was a beheading, but they still kept going. They still kept building. They still kept confronting corruption, confronting abuse of power, risking their lives, running towards danger. And I think a lot of that is a testimony to how Ukrainians see themselves and how their whole history. We talk a lot about our founding fathers, our founding mothers here in the United States. Ukraine's own sense of founding fathers and founding mothers goes back to the year 1000 of the Kiev Rus Empire, where when Moscow was a far-flung wilderness, nothing was there. Kiev was bustling with this significant kingdom that had high literacy rates and good rights for women at the time. And they would marry off princesses and princes to the great royal houses of Europe during the time. They were very influential in their day, and they had monasteries, and they had beautiful churches, and they had this whole beautiful, dynamic, bustling culture that was a place to be during that time in the world, in world history. So Ukraine really sees itself as ancient. And a lot of Ukraine's Walt Whitmans, if you will, a lot of Ukraine's bards, poets, men and women have always paid pilgrimage to have always paid tribute to that with this larger sense of destiny, this larger sense of freedom. You had a constitution of claiming equality back in Ukraine. I don't remember the exact, I want to say the 1600s. It was before the Declaration of Independence. And this is what they pride themselves on, this national identity that is a longing for freedom. They really do see freedom as our religion, intellectual freedom, because it's a very bohemian place. You have a lot of big, exciting cities across Ukraine that are all competing with each other to be the Silicon Valley, a lot of big university hubs, a lot of young people, very avant-garde. All the friends I've made there, like I'd go to parties in Kiev back in 2005, and I had to stand on a stool and recite a poem as soon as I entered. They wouldn't let me in otherwise. Like, it's very cool. It's a very cool place to be. Like, I urge everyone to put Ukraine on your bucket list, obviously when the war's over. I mean, there's parts you could go to now, but even if you went to beautiful, enchanting Lviv with its romantic cobblestone streets in the west, that city is so overrun with refugees and journalists that the plumbing infrastructure is stressed. But do put it on your bucket list to go to Ukraine, because it's such a fascinating ancient history that really prides itself on having incredibly deep roots. And they pride themselves on being intellectual. They really do. That's why they're blowing the West away on how quickly they're learning on these Patriot missiles and these Bradleys, because they really see education, higher education, knowing different languages, and being a leading market for IT talent. They take a lot of pride in that creativity. They really do. It's just something that's in the air there.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah, and it reminded me of like the whole idea of the revolution of dignity, right? It's
yes.
Not like we think dignity here, you better treat me with dignity, but I see it more as this is a societal, we want a society that lives with dignity, right? With freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I want to say the revolution of dignity, Euromaidan, 2013, 2014, spontaneous uprising. It was an art festival. They had a lending library. They had all sorts of musical acts. You had giant murals to Ukraine's iconic poets painted on the side. It was a big old art festival that kept these protesters living in the freezing Arctic cold for months, standing up to a corrupt Kremlin-backed wannabe dictator.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you've read Emily Channel Justice and her work on Maidan, but it's the American left here turns it into like a right-wing Nazi movement, and they miss that it was very much like
such
an
bullshit.
Wall Street.
Yeah,
right? It was like,
yeah.
there was a hard left too, if you will, and like an
Yeah.
Occupy Wall Street. So yeah, I don't mean to carry on. This is your show, but
Yeah. No, it's amazing because I watched the disinformation that clouded the Western understanding of Euromaidan, and they kept all the journalists from the Atlantic, from all the big outlets, kept repeating each other when it came to this neo-Nazi far-right movement. When it was, and you had these Jewish groups in Kiev saying, for the love of God, this is not what it is. We're here too, we're organizing. And it was this whole diverse movement from people from all walks of life. And what ended up happening, all of those think pieces collapsed when Ukraine went to the polls and had an election, and all of the pro-democracy candidates got the overwhelming amounts of the votes, and the boogeymen, the far-right boogeymen that the Western press was trying to convince you were the heart and soul of this revolution, got like barely like 1% combined. And like this, and like Zelensky's Jewish, and like they're like Jewish candidates.
Congress got a higher vote than the right wing, right?
Yeah.
So it's I don't mean to cut you off, but
but there's so much disinformation about Ukraine that spreads in the West. It's scary how effective it is.
Yeah, a lot of parroting. Once one says it, they kind of repeat type of thing. There's so many questions in here. I'm sure you get this one a lot, but people are asking about the scene in the movie with cannibalism. Is it historically accurate that cannibalism took place during this?
Oh yeah, it's I grew up with those stories as a little girl of what people did during the famine to survive, and those are well known. Those are well documented. There is debate in the Ukrainian diaspora of how much they want to talk about that publicly because there's a sense of shame around it. I would again urge everyone to read Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder, because he describes the cannibalism. He describes an orphan in an overrun orphanage of starving children being devoured by the other children. There'd be gangs of these orphans. And yeah, cannibalism, unfortunately, was what people resorted to, because part of the slow murder, the slow death of hunger is madness. You go mad. And my grandfather in his memoir wrote about having to stop his brother from eating the dirt because he was hallucinating that he was seeing food, and he was like chasing the food. So the madness takes over. It's not like, and one of the producers on our film, her grandmother was waiting in a bread line in Ukraine, and a group of cannibals came out of the woods and tried to kidnap her. But the rest of the line fought back and saved her from them. and then she went on to make this movie. But yeah, so unfortunately, because people were driven mad by hunger, and there were rules where, all the wheat fields were being patrolled by Soviet soldiers. And if you went into the field after dark to try to steal a few grains of wheat, you'd be shot on sight. So that was very common. So what people were doing was they were boiling twigs, leaves, mud, dirt. I interviewed one survivor who describes how she and her brothers were boiling a pot over an open fire of twigs, leaves, dirt, and Soviet agents came and just dumped out the whole pot. They would confiscate the stuff people used to feed themselves, plates, forks, knives, whatever. They wanted total starvation. They didn't have a nuclear bomb then. And so how do you, and they were, this, it was just a time of like Henry Ford level efficient killing. The Nazis were engineering their concentration camps. The Soviets were engineering starvation to kill as many people as possible and weaken the country, and then colonize it, because over time they repopulated those areas with Russians. And that's why today Donbass, Eastern Ukraine, is heavily ethnic Russian and Russian speaking. Those are Russians that have been in those regions since 1933. My grandfather was born and raised in Donbass, Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine. He was born and raised speaking Ukrainian, thinking Ukrainian, writing in Ukrainian. And then Stalin came and changed everything and wiped out the Ukrainians. And over time, they brought in the Russians. And now the area is largely ethnically Russian. And Putin then built on Stalin's legacy by invading, by saying, we have to come in and rescue the Russian speakers, just like Hitler had to rescue the German speakers when he, I think, seized off a part of Czechoslovakia.
Right. They're going to feed people after they starve them to death. Right. So people are really pushing back hard, and I think you more than adequately answered it. But just if you want to say something else on this idea that we should not be calling it a genocide, that it was just a famine. We could go into Kazakhstan and they knew there was a famine.
Oh, you mean the famine?
Yeah. So I mean, again, I want to remind these folks who are listening. Andrea is describing, and it's well documented. There's Soviet archives that have been opened up for 30 years now, right? 25, 30 years. They blockaded towns. They blocked people from leaving their towns and went into their homes and took food out of their refrigerators. Okay, so this isn't a historical debate. It's not a historical debate anymore. And there's a certain inhumanity in even trying to make it a debate. I'm sorry to carry on here, but it's emotional to listen to you talk and then compare it to these questions that are just, they're emotional. Yeah.
I think just the existence of the debate itself shows the impact of Russian disinformation all these generations. Right. This was a largely hidden atrocity. And if you don't want to take my word for it, there's a wonderful historian at Stanford University by the name of Norman Naimark, Naimark. He wrote a book called Stalin's Genocides. And one of the genocides is this famine. So I think it's important for people to understand Stalin committed several genocides. And what we're talking about tonight is just one of them. We could do an event like this for every single genocide, including what was done in Kazakhstan, including what was done to the Crimean Tatars, and so on. So if you want to settle once and for all for yourself, the genocide debate, which is, again, Kremlin disinformation warfare done very effectively and elegantly, go get, it's a very thin book. Go get Norman Naimark's Stalin's Genocides. Stalin's Genocides. It's a neat encyclopedic look at Stalin's genocides. The book delivers exactly what it promises, which is just descriptions of Stalin's many genocides that he committed.
Okay, just for the record, that our response indicates that we are working for the CIA, the chat box is saying.
Well, that's funny. I mean, that's really funny. That's really funny. I don't know what to say to that.
I mean, people have to, the documents are no longer secret. Read the documents is what I would say to these people, right? Read the documents.
There's historians are not CIA agents. Historians are historians.
Right.
And facts matter.
So yeah, no one's saying we can't have a debate to the people in the chat, but we want to have a serious, intelligent debate, right? About serious matters that are really contested, not things that aren't contested. There's some interesting questions. This is an actually interesting question. Hearing you talk before we got on here, I think you might have some great insight on this question. Do you see any parallels between Russian aggression, propaganda, and Syria, Ukraine? The one that just got me is what hungry Syrians said, like you would describe, the type of things you would describe about hunger. Hunger drives you to madness. So you see parallels between Russian aggression, propaganda, and Syria and Ukraine.
Yeah, without question. I mean, what the Kremlin was able to get away with in Syria is paying off dividends today. So Syria, what happened? It was part of the Arab Spring. There was a popular uprising. There was a revolution. They were pushing back, and then Assad got boosted by the Kremlin. He was protected by the Kremlin, and now the Kremlin owns Syria flat out. Obama pledged that he was going to have a red line, which was chemical weapons, and Assad marched all over that red line, and Obama did nothing. And Obama's foreign policy was spread very thin, with his team prioritizing the Iran deal, and of course fighting ISIS that sprouted up in the vacuums of power in Iraq and Syria as well. And so Obama had his hands full with ISIS and the Iran deal, and as a result, the Kremlin was able to nab Syria and now has a military base on the Mediterranean, which it uses to great effect to spread its influence across Africa, including in Sudan, where the Kremlin, since the start of the invasion in 2014, has been trying to circumvent Western sanctions by pillaging African nations through their corrupt local proxies on the ground, including Sudan. And Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary group named after Hitler's favorite composer that we mentioned earlier, they are the ones carrying out this Kremlin dirty work, this African colonization. And there's been horrible stories, like in Car, of Wagner soldiers breaking into a maternity hospital and raping women who had just given birth. Look that up. It's in the press. It's been reported on, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. They're also Wagner soldiers, I believe, were also shot several Chinese nationals point blank, and China got a bit upset about that because China's trying to cash in on pillaging as well. China and Russia are in a competitive partnership across Africa, trying to not only seize as much wealth and build as much influence as they can in those countries, but also to drive a wedge against the global democratic alliance, to really go after America's standing in the world. So these are all important dynamics to pay attention to, because Syria was a big win for Putin, one that Europe and the US allowed, and all the disinformation, all of the useful idiots on the far left and far right assisted that. They allowed it to happen. And Syrians, children, they paid the price. And the mass torture, the mass starvation, all of it that continues to this day. It's the world's karma. It's something that we absolutely cannot look away from. And there's a wonderful documentary that was a story of a Syrian mother who picked up a camera and just documented her life inside Syria. And she did it with a baby strapped to her chest. And the movie is called, I believe, For Alma, like for her daughter. She made this documentary documenting their life in war-torn Syria, just again, like Gareth Jones, the power of bearing witness. And we can't look away. We have to engage. For Sama, thank you so much, Terry. For Sama being her daughter. So and that's exactly why we fight. You asked about, why do Ukrainians fight so hard? Why are they so heroic? Is it this history? Is it this generations of trauma? Yes. I interviewed a lot of Ukrainians, including successful tech entrepreneurs, to people from all walks of life. Why did they go to Maidan? Why did you risk your life going to Euromaidan? And they said, because of the stories of what my grandparents went through under the Soviets. So they showed up there for their families, to avenge their families, to get some sort of sense of justice of what was done to their loved ones. For Sama, that right there sums up why we do what we do. Like, why would I spend 14 years trying to get this movie made when it's such a hard movie to make. I didn't do it to get a foot into the industry. I could have broken in a million other ways. I had a day job working in media and newsrooms. I was at Condé Nast. I was at AOL Money and Finance. They were trying to put me on TV to be on talk shows and news shows and tell folks, how to file your taxes this year and get my makeup done and be blonde and sparkly. And I just could not spiritually do that because of my grandfather. So all of us have our own forsama story that engages us with this larger world, that forces us to do something, to take back our agency and refuse to be powerless because we're simply not.
You got a big thank you from the person who asked the Syria question. Just wanted to note that for you. Here, this is a big change of gears. This is something I don't know anything about. I don't know if you could comment on this, but Cargill, the big food manufacturer, I guess they're based in Minneapolis or have some kind of large facility here, and they're asking what role they're playing in the money that's gained from Ukrainian grain. I don't know the backstory to this. I don't know if you can comment on that.
I don't know the backstory of that. I know that in terms of Ukrainian grain, Ukraine is one of the largest grain exporters in the world. They feed the Middle East, Africa. If those grain shipments get disrupted, it's going to have it's going to send shockwaves to a lot of already vulnerable populations. And so as a result, you have Ukrainian farmers risking their lives, demining a lot of these fields so they can get their grain out. And you've had some pillars of the farming community in Ukraine who have been killed by Russia's invasion. So Ukraine has lost a lot in terms of human resources to keep that country running, given how we're all so connected and dependent, including vulnerable countries in the Middle East and Africa that need that grain. So I think the larger story is what Ukrainians have been putting up with and dealing with just to continue to do their part to feed the world, and what a hit the grain output has taken, and how as part of their invasion, the Russians are trying to seize as much grain and grain infrastructure as they can, which is obviously very reminiscent of the Holodomor. And in terms of, Western companies, what their role is in that, I mean, that's what their role should be, doing everything they can to put, as a business community, to put pressure on greater sanctions for Russia, to force the Russian elite to stay in Russia. Don't let their wives go prancing around in Western capitals, spending all that blood money as they've been doing, posting videos, cute little videos of themselves on Instagram and so on. That's disgusting. They should be forced to stay back in Russia to confront the horrific country that the greed and corruption is making. And the business community should do all they can to help Ukraine function and invest and share best practices with the Ukrainians over there and give them donate the resources they need.
There's a question here. I'm not sure if I'm going to butcher this one. It's lengthy and I'm going to condense it to a few words, but what lessons can the US learn from the forced genocide, I'm going to say, because I don't want to dance around it, in Ukraine? What can we learn from that with our own history of displacing and exterminating American Indians, Native Americans? Is there something to be learned there?
Yeah, I think we have to just make room, make space for all genocides, and to take a moment to sit with this history, and to be conscious and aware of the effects that history has had today. I mean, this invasion, this total genocidal invasion, did not happen just overnight. It's history playing out. There's the history, but as you see in my film, Mr. Jones explains why Ukraine is so important to Russia and their imperialist ambitions, and why Putin brought back the cult of Stalin. So in terms of understanding ourselves as a country, like, we are on land where populations of families, communities were wiped out to such a severe extent that it literally changed the temperature of the planet. And in the place of those communities, we've brought back this greed is good, exploitation, top down, this force is good, the biggest gun wins. This gun culture, I'd even say, goes way back through, it comes from this genocide in its place, and that's not right. And I think to honor those that were killed is to learn their history, is to hold place for historical truth, and to also try to bring back what those communities stood for and the balance that they lived in, and bring that balance back today into our own lives, and bring that community back into our own lives, and come together and say no to that sort of genocidal strain in our history that rears its ugly head today in this rampant, nutty, violent gun culture where people just shoot you if you pull into like the wrong driveway. I mean, that's very casual violence. Like, people go immediately to violence, and people should not be surprised that that's happening. And it's so widespread because we're living in a land that was built by genocide.
Do you see any linkages, not necessarily, isomorphic one-to-one, or connections between Russian disinformation narratives today around Ukraine and the tactics that were deployed in the 1930s? Do you see parallels and intersection?
Oh, without question. I mean, there's a zeal. You mentioned Russian, Medvedev and others talking about like this genocidal zeal.
Right.
We're gonna kill the Ukrainians, slaughter them so there's nothing left. They had that same zeal back in the 1930s when they were going to slaughter the Ukrainians. All genocides start with hate speech and propaganda. The Soviets produced films showing the Ukrainian farmers, dramatizing the Ukrainian farmers burning their own crops rather than give it over to the collective farm, and showing them as locusts, showing images of locusts and then images of the Ukrainian farmers burning their crops. That's genocidal imagery, saying these are bugs, we have to go in and squash them. And on top of like the soldiers, the proper Soviet soldiers that went in and carried out this genocide, you had these agents, these gung-ho true believers full of zeal, genocidal zeal. And you see that same energy today coming out of the Z movement in Russia. And this pride, it's a pride in imperialistic genocidal ambitions. And it proudly uses a lot of genocidal language, and they're cheering on Russian bombs, killing civilians and leveling towns. They're cheering it on. And they had that same energy in terms of, we're going to squash Ukraine, squash the Ukrainian farmer. Stalin and the Russians didn't forget that during the Russian Revolution, Ukrainians for a time fought for their independence and won. There was several years there where Ukraine was independent. They were winning the war for independence during the chaos of the Russian Revolution, and Russia never got over that. They never forgot. So they loved this idea of, we're finally gonna just bring Ukraine to its knees, and Ukraine's ours. Crimea's ours, Crimea nash, Crimea's ours in Russian. And it's very hard, even for some of the so-called Russian opposition figures. It's very hard for them to say, give Crimea back. They don't really want to.
Right. Yeah, once again, to some of the comments, I urge people, just go back to the Russian media, late February 2002, early March 2002. And it's so upsetting that you'll think it's fake. It's like Andrea's comments are minimal compared to what you'll see on there. But anyway, here's a question. What do you think peace activists in the United States should do? And how do you think the war will end?
I think continue doing events like this. You could have a screening of For Salma. You could invite all sorts of people like me just to have gatherings like this. And you could also be creative. Like I was thinking a lot about Ukraine's resistance and the civil rights resistance, music, singing, choruses, any types of songs. Like you could go caroling at some of these protests. Like they sang so much at Euromaidan, and they'd have bands, enlist local bands. Like I have
Ruslana, right? Ruslana was there singing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, and so protest, standing up for human rights, turn it into an art festival, express yourselves, be creative, hold your events in creative spaces. Like don't be, really inspire each other to be creative. It's okay. Like, I know we're dealing with very heavy issues, but when Ukrainians were staring down the barrel of a gun with Euromaidan, they were having a big old block party doing it, and there with all the musicians and all the acts coming through so joy, basically joy, falling in love, art, those are all beauty. Bring as much of that beauty and energy as you can to the world, because that's all resistance. For Sama, a mother picked up a video camera and decided to be creative. Don't hold back, unleash that part of yourself, and have empathy for yourself and others. Recognize that you're loving and lovable. Really hold that space for yourself and others. See yourself as that way, and that's where your power is going to come from. And yes, and part of these gentle discussions, you have conversations about trauma. You bring that to the surface because you have no idea what lives you might save by doing that.
Question I always ask.
And how the war ends. Sorry.
Yeah.
So Putin is notoriously stubborn. He always pushes deals too far. It could end if he dies. That's a long time to wait. He's increasingly isolated because he's losing, and he's out of touch. He's like the mad King George over there. They know it increasingly. A lot of the phone calls that are getting leaked between these oligarchs are hilarious of how much they're trashing Putin and the others. There's also a civil war among the elites of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner Group. And so that's going to be heating up as they circle the sharks circle to see who's going to take the place of Putin. And all of those things I just described are going to further weaken the war effort. The greatest ally the Russians have, given their chaos, given their dysfunction, given their corruption, the greatest ally they have are the Republicans here in the United States who write op-eds saying, why are we sending our tax dollars over there? And the Tucker Carlsons, the Matt Gaetzes, the Mike Lee, Senator of Utah, all of that Kremlin disinformation that they're spouting, trying to sow doubt into the United Front. That's what's dangerous. If we were to get a president and a Congress that lost their humanity and forfeited the fight and gave Ukraine away like they gave Syria away, like the U.S. government collectively, I'd say, give Syria away. If it gets to that, it's going to be such a huge victory for the Kremlin that they're going to build off of to go even deeper further with their imperialist ambitions, just like they're doing that now across Africa, thanks in part to having that big old military base in Syria from which to operate from.
Right, but
So I don't know. So I don't know when the war is going to end, but I know that we have to have a long game, and we can't make the same mistakes as Syria. But I do know that if Putin dies, it does give the Russians a reset opportunity, and we absolutely need to push them out of Donbass. We need to push them out of Crimea, because if we don't, we're leaving them staging grounds to just recoup and rebuild and relaunch another invasion. It's
right. That's what they want.
It's so important that people learn from World War II with Chamberlain. There is no land for peace. Land for peace does not work. It is delusional. You cannot do land for peace. If you want the war to end, put pressure on Russia, Russian businesses, Russian figures that are for the war, and put pressure on Russia. Don't talk to NATO. Don't talk to Ukraine about this. They're not the ones causing the war. Like, the US did not want this war. They try to give Zelensky an exit. They try to get Zelensky out. They did not want this. So put the pressure on the Russians and Belarus. And those are the ones that created the war.
Thank you. So I think that's all our questions on the chat. I hope I didn't miss anything. Someone's just asking about, what do you think of Zelensky's leadership?
I mean, it's just so surprising. I am very surprised. And I think from working with these great, I'm so sorry you couldn't see my clip, but working with Vanessa Kirby, Peter Sarsgaard, James Norton, these are deeply intelligent, thoughtful, sensitive people. They are brilliant artists that intuitively just capture the moment. Zelensky is a great artist. And I think when you have that artistic muscle, it's just something not all great artists are great people, because there are some great artists that are for the war in Russia. But I'm just saying that I think it's many great artists are in touch with their humanity. And I think that's where it comes from, like that he was able to rise to the occasion.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, right? him of all people, but yeah, it's
Yeah, and he represents modern Ukraine. Zelensky's are a dime a dozen across Ukraine. That's why you have all this creativity. Russian warship, go fuck yourself. It's like that the kid that did that, the border guard that did that on Snake Island, represents this young Ukraine. So it's really a generational battle of this Western-facing internet American movies, Die Hard, watching Ukraine versus old stuffy KGB man.
Yeah, I work with Ukrainian schools, so I'm doing like a partnership, and you could literally witness in a room the older generation, and we like throw our hands up, the Soviet mentality.
Yes.
And the young kids who are really embracing democratic norms, so on. If you could feel it, you could see it. It's an amazing historical moment in my opinion. I don't need to go. So
no, absolutely.
So people are still asking about the genocide of the Native Americans. I think you answered that. I think we got most questions answered, and we're coming near the 8:30 hour. So I think there's some things I have to do to wrap this up. The first thing I will do is, with great sincerity, Andrea, I thank you. I feel expanded by your ability to articulate things in a humanistic way with detail. And this was an amazing event for me. So I feel that I learned a lot tonight, and I appreciate it. I'm sure the audience feels likewise.
Oh, I'm so glad. Well, I thank you all for being here. And I thank you, Carl, Leah, Don, Terry, Andy. This was such an honor. And I'm so grateful for you. All of you are doing so much. Keep standing in your truth. Keep demanding peace. Keep shining your lights out there, because we desperately all need to be doing that right now. And really search for the joy. Don't let them deprive you of joy. Like be joy machines wherever you are.
That's a good message. Yeah. Do more of that. Then I think someone somewhere in the control room there is supposed to put something up on the screen about global synergy. So yeah, here's a little pitch. Global synergy, with what I've learned about this organization, is bringing Ukrainian kids here to the United States for exchange programs. They're doing so much great work that I can't detail it all in a matter of a minute. So what they ask is, if you enjoyed tonight's event, I know I'm going to go to the website and give something. On behalf of Andrea's presentation, it's globalsynergygroup.org. If you please check it out. I know almost every presentation today on Ukraine is accompanied by such a pitch, because Ukrainians need help. They need money, right? That's you're Ukraine, you can get a full meal for $4. So they're hurting. Their economy is hurting. Human beings are hurting. So anything that you can find to give, that would be greatly appreciated. So that is our event, and I feel exhilarated right now. And thank you very much, Andrea Chalupa. And we will say good night, folks.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Take care. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.